Alrighty, let me make sure this is recording. Oh, it disappeared. Okay. All right, welcome back. Welcome to lecture 2. Now, I have held up my end of the bargain and I have created these podcasts. I've handpicked the information I have placed in these podcasts from the chapters so we can weed through a lot of inefficiency and, in a sense, wasted time. Now, I'm not going to lecture you directly on these chapters. That'd be redundant and, again, probably counterproductive in my wish to not waste time. So I'm going to open with a question. And this will be trigger warning. I'm going to ask you to critically think every step of the way in this class. And I know you are all capable of it because every single one of us at some point is critically thinking. It may not be consciously, but there are portions of our life in which we focus in on and we really want to know. We really need to break down, to dissect questions that we ask of ourselves and the people around us, whomever they may be. That being said, the question that I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put to you in this lecture is going to center around today is, what is truth? Now, because I haven't been able to get it approved yet to meet in class, which buckle up because I am going to try and get down there and commandeer a room that those of you who want to come in person, I will record it. But those of you who want to come in person, A, just to meet me, and B, just to get an in-person lecture, to sit in a classroom and throw your questions at me, we're going to do that. Okay. However, since I cannot do that now, I am going to throw some things at you, right? When I ask you, what is truth? When I ask a class in general, what is truth? Few of the common things that I hear are facts, right? Truth represents the facts. Truth is reality, right? Truth is something that happened. Truth is scientifically corroborated, right? Truth is God. Truth is evidence. Truth is proof, right? Something that is verifiable, right? But my question in response to those answers, and possibly anything else you have to offer, would be another question in terms of moving deeper, right? What is truth is a surface question. The deeper question is, if truth is objective, as let's say our justice system means for it to be, or portrays it to be, why do intelligent people disagree so often? Now, there's another word here that we probably wouldn't or haven't been conditioned. Sorry, I've been talking all day, but what we have probably been conditioned more or less to, let's say, look over, or been conditioned against connecting the concept, would be interpretation, right? Is your interpretation of the truth different than my interpretation of the truth? And if so, is one more valid than the other? What would make one more valid than the other? Now, let me stop you here. I know you're thinking, I know this may have your brain ticking away, and that's good. And that's right where we want to be. But this is where, as an instructor, I say, slow down, stop the train for a second, because this is a deceivingly easy question. Because in fact, is anybody else's truth more valid than another person's? And I have probably heard any number of responses to this. The most common, however, is, of course, if someone is lying, then the person who's telling the truth is more valid. But more often than not, you can have two people in the same place experience the same event and come out with completely different stories, perspectives, or narratives of what occurred and how. That's not even including how they felt or what was directly impactful to them. That is just asking them what in fact happened. Excuse me. And usually when I pose this to my classes, we digress down another familiar lane, and that is, well, someone of higher authority would be more valid. More credibility equals more validity, right? But is that true? Is that fair? I'm sorry. What is wrong in my throat? But of course, as soon as I start lecturing, never fails. Actually, hold on. I get some colder water. That might do the trick. Okay, so back to the question at hand, or the notion at hand, that credibility, authority are all tied directly to validity. Now, I am not here to tell you what to think, much to some of your dismay. Rather, I am here to teach you how to think, right? As any instructor really is. So from here, this is the question I pose. When we look at these coming up chapters, or these upcoming chapters, said that incorrectly, we are taking in the idea of reality, our reality and other people's reality, right? Some of you have siblings, some of you have roommates, some of you have close friends, some of you have families, right? Whether you are still a child in that scenario or dynamic, or you are now a parent in that dynamic. But all of us at some point have probably been in a situation where there is an event that happened and someone else either perceived us or the event differently than we perceived ourselves or our experience within the event. And that is where the divide occurs because experience is shared, but interpretation is individualistic. Right? They are not the same thing and they are not interchangeable. This is because the event itself is subjective. The meaning is subjective. And this is where psychology comes in to study that gap. Now, if we are really going to dig, and we today are really going to dig, this brings about the question of what is perception? Right now, is perception the same as interpretation? No, because perception is how you see something, and interpretation is how you interpret that something, right? Which is to say, how do I make that less confusing, right? Reality is perception is a common misnomer, right? But if perception is reality, whose reality, if we have different perceptions, is acceptable, right? Mine, yours, everyone's. Can all perceptions be simultaneously true? If not, then what is actually true? Again, this foe we meet, right? This idea of truth and the idea that there is only one truth. My mother had a saying, there are always three sides to a story, right? Your side, the other person's side, and the actual truth. The only one of those that you will never get is the actual truth. As a child, that was very frustrating to me. As a psychology major, it was still frustrating to me. As a parent, remain frustrated. but not by that notion, more of having to explain it to my children. So let's dig a little deeper on perception, since this is one of our opening chapters, right? Perception is the brain interpreting sensory information, right? Your eyes don't understand the world, even though that's what we have come to identify as perceiving, right? Your brain is what does the perceiving. Your eyes do all the catching of images, right? Your ears don't actually hear music. Your brain interprets the vibrations. These are tools, and the brain is basically the modem, the PC, not modem, right? That is making sense of what the eyes and the ears pick up. Now, your tongue doesn't actually taste chocolate. Your brain associates that flavor with that food. Everything we experience passes through interpretation, right? But it's a process. Perception is how we pick it up, our eyes and our ears and sensory, tactile, right? And interpretation is what the brain does with it. So I'm hoping that I have clarified that concept of why perception and interpretation are not actually the same, although they are often misused as interchangeably, as interchangeable. What's wrong with me adding "ly" on pretty much everything or weird subsets to words, but it's been a day and we are going to plow right through it. Take this as a testament that your professor is human. Now, we are circling back this concept of truth versus interpretation, right? We asked what truth was, and we pitted truth against perception. And now we are going to move forward and pit truth against interpretation, right? I want you to get a piece of paper out, right? Just like we would if we were in class. And I want you to write truth on one side and draw a little T chart. All right, write truth on the left side, interpretation on the right side. Okay, so you have the big line, the vertical line separating the two. Now, I want you to start putting examples of how you can definitively verify either. And by this, I mean, give me some quantifiable examples of truth and some quantifiable examples of interpretation, right? So let's say the sky is blue. Is that truth? If you think so, then you write it down, right? Now, we're going to talk about that. Is the sky blue? I still want you to write some examples on both sides, right? You can do this as we move through the rest of this lecture. And this assignment we'll say it may come in handy for one of those discussions that I've mentioned, right? Now, sorry, I'm making notes too. Place that in one of our discussions, right? This is me winging it as I lecture. Welcome to real life. I teach like this in person too, so there's no escaping it, it would appear. But let's ask, is the sky actually blue? And I love this question because as a child, I did ask this question. So it's a little dear to my heart because one person said, well, can't you see it? Obviously, right? As I got older, I felt very lied to because in science class, I learned that it's actually a refraction of that color, right? The gas refracts it, and it's that particular gas and the rays of light, right? Which all we won't get too deep into the whole mix of it, right? But when you have a prism, you have light shines through it, you have a series of lights that come out. That's what makes the rainbow. It is not my day today, but that's what makes the rainbow. When you see something and it's that color, it's because every other color is absorbed by that item, and the color you see is the actual color that's being refracted, meaning it's being bounced back. It's not being absorbed, and that's why you see it. So, in actuality, one might say the sky is anything but blue. The irony and the interest within that. I I can't say that as a psychology major, I ever get bored with that example because it is a solid example. It is a difficult example, but it is also a common example within the formation of the human brain. As a child, most of us at one point in time have looked up at the sky and wondered, why is the sky blue? If not actually asked that particular question. It's probably, I think statistically, I looked it up one time. It is one of the highest, we'll say, one of the most commonly statistically asked questions in kindergarten through first grade, which is interesting to me because a lot of people think that at that age, children are not capable of critical thinking. And in truth, I think that is the very definition of critical thinking, right? Asking why. That is a skill that I find that adults, whether it's in parenting, in school, some sort of authoritative position, really like to put an end to because if you ask why, the social expectation is for us to answer. And if we don't know, the social interpretation to most people is that we look weak. We look unable to meet the social expectation. If the question can be asked, then the question should be answered. So, in an avoidance behavior and technique, has become very common for many parents to try and squash the question of why out of children, right? It becomes a defiance issue, an obstinance, otherwise disobedience, right? But in reality, it's a curiosity issue. Now, does that question sometimes come with behavioral issues? Absolutely. Are the two synonymous? No. But what I'm getting at here is you should never stop asking why throughout your life, but we are conditioned throughout childhood and adolescence not to ask why because it's considered disrespectful or disobedient. And in that, therein lies the problem, right? Because then as adults, we expect the children that we've raised not to ask why, to be able to critically analyze and definitively question the things around them and make decisions based on this sophisticated thought process, which we have conditioned out of them, right? And I want you to think about that. I want that to sit there for you as food for thought, right? If you have parents, maybe talk about that with them. Maybe ask them just what their perspective on that is, and they don't have to agree with me. This is the beauty of parenting, of being an individual, of being your own person, right? We're all allowed our own opinion. It doesn't make me right or them wrong or them right and me wrong or you right. That was a lot of wrongs and rights. And that is a measure in this world that I think does us the most injustice, right? Because that is very black and white, that is very quantifiable. And in truth, everything is really in the gray, right? Especially depending on how you're approaching the question of what is truth. So I'm going to give you another example of something we deal with every day in our everyday life, because again, as I told you, I want you to take these concepts and these theories and I want you to search for them among your everyday life. And there are some things we do, we take for granted, we don't think about, but we interact with, or we subscribe to, or we're conditioned to respond as, right? Without even consciously knowing it or really realizing it. Never consider it because it's routine, right? We're on autopilot. Anybody ever get in their car and go somewhere and so something's on their mind and all of a sudden they're at work or they're at school or they've come home, right? I've done that. I think we're all guilty of that at some point, right? Now, some of us actually stop and say, how did I get here? Some of us don't. Some of us are just continuing to think about or ruminate would be a good word, right? On whatever was occupying our thoughts at the time. Now, most of the time, there are exceptions, but we have still managed to abide by traffic laws, stop at stop signs, stop at red lights, recognize that the light is green and continue going, right? Make left turns, make right turns. So we are in not just a physical autopilot, we are in a mental interpretation autopilot because that is us subconsciously adhering to the social laws and mores that are expected of us. And in that, the interesting facet is when people say it's the law, you watch shows like Law and Order, there's this portrayal of the law as finite, as what would be a good way to diminish that verboseness? Let's say there is this idea of, we'll say, stringence or very strict adherence required for the law because the law is black and white, right? The law says this, and this is the law. Unless we are a policymaker or somebody who works in legislation, we can only vote on them. We do not get to determine what becomes a law and what doesn't outside of voting. And in that context, we give the authority to others, right, to enforce that law. We go from police, right, to district attorneys. And at the district attorney level, right, we would have a lawyer because that's as our right when we are being persecuted. I'm sorry, prosecuted. Again, it's wordplay. But then you have a judge, right? You have this whole series of, we'll say, multifaceted layers within the law. Why do we have this? If the law is so black and white, why do we need this? And that question comes because the law lives in the gray. The law is a subject to interpretation as the color of somebody's blouse, right? Anybody ever been like, I like that color on you. That's a perfect green. And somebody goes, that's not green, that's turquoise. And you're like, oh, I'm sea green. And somebody else is like, no, that's teal, right? Because that's a series of different perspectives, right? Now, some of you are like, those colors are distinctly different. And while I might agree with that summation, at the same time, I can tell you that I have been in a situation where there were several different perceptions on what a color was, right? And in my experience, the only thing that would settle something like that is if it says on the tag exactly what color it is. So it makes no matter, but that's because we accept the things we read. If somebody mislabels purple as burgundy, we're going to say that's not purple, it's burgundy because the tag says it is. Now, are some of us more flexible, more lenient? I'm going to say, well, that must have been a mistake. Sure. Are others going to take that to the grave as irrefutable proof that that is burgundy? Of course. And that is their right. Now, getting back to the analogy of the law, I want you guys to think about this. And for the purpose of this, we're going to call it a thought plot. Okay. I want you to just relax and open your mind to the process and not come up with a million alternatives, what ifs, right? That is a tendency for anyone, humans alike, right? To hear something and say, well, not if this happens or what if this happens, right? We're just going to go in a general, very general process and we're going to say timeline of events in order to analyze how the justice system is supposed to function. So let's say I am driving and I get pulled over. Now, let's say I did run a red light. Maybe I punched it through an orange and it turned red, and the officer decided that I needed to be pulled over, right? So comes up to my window, license registration. Do you know I pulled you over? And I may say, I have no idea. Or I may say, because I went through the orange light, And he may say, well, that you did, but I'm going to have to arrest you because that was reckless driving. You endangered others when you made that decision to punch it through the orange light. Now, that sounds silly to all of us, right? But again, this is just a thought plot. This is just a simulation, okay? But that's viable, right? We give police officers the authority in our society to enforce the laws which we have voted in. So we've okayed the laws by vote, well, majority has, right? And then we, as citizens of a township, a cityship, or just a nation in general, especially this nation, right, have given authority to police to enforce the laws, and we have been conditioned to accept it. So that is what we know, right? Thus, he puts handcuffs on me and we move forward. So let's say I get booked and he sends this reckless driving charge up to the DA. Now, maybe the DA says, well, reads the story and says, I don't know if that's reckless driving, right? So maybe the officer was a little, we'll say, exaggerated in his interpretation, right? A little gun ho. So maybe we'll drop it down to a ticket and I may be released. On the other hand, maybe maybe after I went through that red light, maybe after, maybe punching it through the orange light when we're supposed to go slow, and then being in the intersection when it turned red, and then maybe taking a block to pull over, right? Maybe all of that constituted in three different acts of reckless endangerment, right? Of my peers, of other civilians. And so maybe the prosecutor decides to interpret that I committed three acts instead of just one. And so he ups my charges. Well, then I have to get a defense attorney, right? And so then we have a prosecutor and we have a defense attorney. And the jobs of the defense attorney and the prosecutor are to present a case. They present a case to the judge in a hearing, right? The burden of proof lies on the state. The state has to prove that I am guilty of these three different charges, right? And my defense attorney has to argue in a rather persuasive fashion that I am not guilty. But all this is one giant act of persuasion on two sides, right? The district attorney side and my attorney side, right? They are persuading one person, a judge, for an indictment. Now, once I get indicted, if I get indicted, let's say my lawyer doesn't present a plausible case, right? And so the judge says, well, I've heard both perspectives and I am siding with the DA. And they're not, of course, going to say that. They're going to say, I find evidence to be sufficient to push you forward. Indictment carried on, right? So then I have a choice. I can have a trial by jury or I can have a trial by judge. Those are your two rights. So again, it becomes another, we'll call it circumstance of persuasion, because if I go in front of a jury, that's 12 of my peers whom either the DA, the prosecutor, right, has to persuade that I'm guilty, or my defense attorney has to persuade I am not guilty. If I just have a judge, if I waive my right to a jury and I just have a trial by judge, then each of them is again having to convince or persuade that judge that I am either guilty or not guilty, both according to their roles within this circumstance. Now, all in all, what is persuasion? What do we base persuasion on? Well, we base persuasion on interpretation. We are betting the farm on an idea that whatever argument is provided, either from the DA or from the defense attorney, that 12 people or that one judge is going to have an experience or a series of experiences or an understanding of the law that's similar to our own, which would in turn allow them to better understand and be more open to being persuaded to our side of the fence. And therein lies that question again. What is truth? Even in our justice system, it is just a series of interpretation, right? The officer interpreting my law, my behavior as unlaw abiding, right? As not law abiding, to clarify, right? As the DA picking up the charges or dropping them, again, subject to interpretation on both counts. And then the judge saying, okay, yes, as a prosecutor, you have met your burden of proof for me to continue on and charge this person. Or no, you have not met your burden of proof. Go back and try again, right? For a defense attorney, right? You have met your burden of proof that this, or you have successfully persuaded me that the burden of proof is not being held up by the prosecutor. And I agree with you. Your client should go free. They have not broken the law as it is meant to be interpreted. Now, I always find that interesting. Anybody who's had any dealings with the legal system, whether civil or criminal, will understand that it's always a gambit on how something's going to turn out because every judge is different, every lawyer is different, every district attorney or assistant DA is different because each and every one of us is interpreting based on our own set of life experiences. So there's no telling where somebody's empathy or where their perspective may better align, on whom, with whom it may better align. So even something as important and black and white as our justice system is subject to interpretation, aka perception. I want you guys to think about that because every day when we're driving, when we're not committing crimes, when we are committing crimes, I'm not saying anybody is or anybody's not. I'm using we as a theoretical concept, right? But when in motion in daily life, whether we're abiding by laws or not abiding by laws, we are affected. We are impacted. We are subconsciously conditioned, right, to adhere to these social expectations and lawful, right, lawful guidelines. Or we, our experience and our, let's say, our moral compass, right, points other directions due to our other life influences, right? Whether that be environmental or even genetic. Now, what I find interesting about that, and I'm sure you guys didn't see that coming, right? How I just knocked us right there into nature versus nurture. That is an age-old argument, and it can be applied. It rears its ugly head in almost everything, right? But many people think, hey, criminals choose to be criminals. Addicts choose to be addicts, right? Some people don't try hard enough at sports, so they choose to suck at sports. Some people don't try hard enough in school, so they choose not to get good grades. Oh, any one of us who has any experience in any of the above probably may have some sort of experience that can contradict that, right? Maybe some of us feel like our experiences validate that. Again, I'm not here to tell you what to think, and I'm not here to diminish either side of that line, wherever your experiences may lie. Instead, I'm here to make you think about that, right? Where do these deviations in human behavior come from? Do they come from your environment? Does it matter where you're raised? Does it matter who raises you? Does it matter the social expectations of the area and community in which you are raised? Or is it all simply who got together and genetically created you, right? Again, that comes nature, genetics versus nurture, your environment. Now, don't let that mislead you because nurture does not mean you have to be coddled or cared for or loved or whatnot. Nurture just basically is coining the idea of environment, whether it is a wonderful environment or a terrible environment. And nature is just coining the idea of genetic responsibility for behavior. Interestingly enough, I am going to pose a TED Talk. Um, and I think I'm going to let you sit on that. And I will probably post another lecture sometime this weekend. And this weekend is when I'll post some of these discussions. I'll open these discussions so you can post how these podcasts affected you, what struck you about them, and this lecture, what you didn't know, things that made you think. But also, I'll probably make another discussion where we can list some of our truth versus interpretation examples. And then I'll make a third discussion where we can discuss the things that shocked us or intrigued us or absolutely did not interest us in relation to the TED Talk that I'm going to post. Now, I haven't found one person I didn't pull in, period, but there's a first time for everything. Anyway, so that really is where we're going to end this lecture for now. I think we've covered pretty much all of our chapters. I haven't, of course, covered everything, and I know what you're thinking. Profi, why did you not discuss why this all matters? Well, but I have, right? Because I asked, what is truth, right? What is interpretation? What is influence, right? What is perception? And I've given you actual real life, real time examples that we are all subject to, that are ruled by any and all of the above. Why this matters, right, is because psychology doesn't necessarily tell us what the truth is. Psychology asks a different and perhaps a more profound question, right? How do we as human beings come to believe in truth or define truth, right? So some closing thoughts after our thought plot is, let's go with talking about experiencing the world directly, right? Because that's part of why I want you to take these concepts and identify them in your everyday life, right? Because we experience the world through a nervous system that learns and remembers and filters, interprets, and even reconstructs reality, right? Psychology is not simply the study of behavior, it's a study of the processes that transform experience, influence, interpretation, perception into what we ultimately define as truth, right? And there is a convergence and there is a divergence, right? Because if we all converged constantly, some of us would lose our individuality because we do not see all the things the same. It's just not possible to be an individual and be like everyone else, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not to say there aren't similarities or shared perspectives. That's just to say that we are always going to be uniquely ourselves, right? Just like our fingerprints, right? Every mark we leave will be distinctly ours, no matter how similar it may be to someone else's. It will never be identical, right? Not even with identical twins, interestingly enough, right? We will get into that again when I bring back the lecture, because I will be giving another lecture on the TED Talk that I post. I will not be posting the TED Talk because I don't want you guys to stress out, probably until, let's say, Friday afternoon. I don't know. We'll think about it. I may post it earlier. I'll give myself some time to mull over that because just like you, I'm going to take time to sit back and think about where our lecture has taken me, has taken us, and now has actually taken the course. I hope that all of you have an excellent afternoon, and I hope that you're enjoying these. I hope that they're helping. Please, again, I'm always here for you. Feel free to email me, text me. I will be posting some office hours next week when I'll be here and available. So look for those. Have a great day, guys.